The Maya by Dr. Michael E. Coe. Chapter 8. Maya Life on the Eve of the Conquest. While we have until this moment dealing mainly with the pots, jades, and ruins of a once great people, we actually know a good deal more than this about the daily life of the Maya, particularly of the natives of Yucatan on the eve of the conquest. For it is our own good fortune that the early Spanish missionaries were accomplished scholars, in that owing to their eagerness to understand the nations they wished to convert to the cross, they have left us with first-class anthropological accounts of native culture as it was just before they came. So it is upon this foundation that we must interpret the archaeological remains of the post-classic Maya, and the Maya of the classic as well. The farm and the chase. Maya agriculture, which has been described in some detail in Chapter 1, was the foundation of their civilization. Maize, beans, squashes, chili peppers, cotton, and various kinds of root crops and fruit trees were cultivated. That the pre-conquest lowlanders usually prepared their plots by the slash and burn method is certain, but exactly how large trees were felled prior to the adoption of copper axes in the post-classic and of the still ones in colonial days is unclear. Perhaps they were merely ringed and left to die. The times of planting were under the control of a kind of farmer's almanac of which we apparently have examples in the two codices. According to Landa, fields were communally owned and jointly worked by groups of 20 men, but this may not be very close to the real picture, as we shall see. In Yucatan, the Maya stored their crops in above-ground cribs of wood, but also in fine underground places, which might well be the tultunob, so common in classic sites. The Spanish sources consistently fail to mention tortillas or flat cakes, pecua, for the lowland Maya, while a few clay griddles have been found in post-classic occupations in sites like Lamanai. These may have been used to toast cacao beans rather than tortillas. However, other ways of preparing maize are mentioned in the sources. These include saca, a cornmeal gruel which was taken with chili pepper as the first meal of the day, keyen, a mixture of water and sourdough carried in gourds to the fields for sustenance during the day, and the well-known tamales, kihilwa, which turn up in food offerings found painted in late classic ceramics. The peasant cuisine, we know little of that current among the elite class, was largely confined to such simple foods and to stews compounded from meat and vegetables, to which were added squash seeds and peppers. Cash crops were of prime importance to Yucatan. Cotton was widely grown, for the province was famed for its textiles, which were exported over a very large area. Along river drainages in southern Campeche, Tabasco, and Belize, and on the Pacific slope of Guatemala, groves of cacao trees were planted, but in the north these were restricted to the bottoms of filled in cenotes and other natural depressions. The cacao bean from this tree provided chocolate, the preferred drink of the Mesoamerican ruling classes, but well into colonial times the bean served as a form of money in regional markets. So precious were they that the Maya traders encountered off the coast of Honduras by Columbus were said to have snatched up any that had dropped, as though it was their own eyes that had fallen to the canoe bottom. Every Maya household had its own kitchen garden in which vegetables and fruit trees were raised, and fruit groves were scattered near settlements as well. Papaya, avocado, custard apple, sapodilla, and the bread nut tree were all cultivated, but many kinds of wild fruits were also eaten, especially in times of famine. There were several breeds of dog current among the Maya, each with its own name. One such strain was barkless. Males were castrated and fattened on corn, and either eaten or sacrificed. Another was used in the hunt. Both wild and domestic turkeys were known, but only the former used as sacrificial victims in ceremonies. As he still does today, the Maya farmer raised the native stingless bees, which are kept in small hollow logs closed with mud plaster at either end and stacked up in A-frames, but wild honey was also much appreciated. The larger mammals, such as deer and peccary, were hunted with the bow and arrows in drives, though in classic times the atlat and dart must have been the principal weapon, aided by packs of dogs. Birds like the wild turkey, partridge, wild pigeon, quail, and wild duck were taken with pellets shot from blowguns. A variety of snails and deadfalls are shown in the Madrid Codex, especially a trap for armadillo. In Yucatan, fishing was generally of the offshore kind, by means of sweep and drag nets and hook and line, but fish were also shot with bow and arrow in lagoons. Inland, especially in the highland streams, stupefying drugs were pounded in the water, and the fish taken by hand once they had floated into artificial dams. One of the beautifully incised bones from late classic Tikal shows that this was also the practice in the Peten. Along the coast, the catch was salted and dried or roasted over a fire for use in commerce. Among the wild products of the lowland forests, of great cultural importance to the Maya was palm, the resin of the copal tree, which, along with rubber and chewing gum, was used as incense. So holy was this that one native source describes it as the odor of the center of heaven. Another tree produced a bark for flavoring balche, a strong and stinking meal imbibed in vast amounts during festivals. Curiously, balche is apparently not mentioned in classic texts. What is mentioned is chich, a fermented beverage made from agaves, one known in modern Mexico by its colonial period name, pulque. Industry and commerce. Yucatan was the greatest producer of salt in Mesoamerica. The beds extended along the coast from Campeche, along the lagoons on the north side of the peninsula, and over to the Isla Mujeres on the east. The salt, which Landa praised as the best which I have ever seen in my life, was collected at the end of the dry season by the coastal peoples who held a virtual monopoly over the industry, although at one time it was entirely in the hands of the overlord of Mayapan. A few localities inland also had salt wells, such as the Chicoy Valley of Guatemala, but it was sea salt that was in most demand, and this was carried widely all over the Maya area. Other valuable Yucatan exports were honey, cotton mantles, and slaves, and one suspects that it was such an industrial specialization which supported the economy, not maize agriculture. Further regional products involved in native trade were cacao, which could only be raised in a few well-watered places, especially the perpetually damp bottoms of the waterless cenotes, quetzal feathers from the Alta Verapaz, flint and chert from deposits in the central area, obsidian from the highlands northeast of Guatemala's heady and colored shells, particularly the thorny oyster, from both coasts. Jade and a host of lesser stones of green color were also traded, most originating in the beds of the Motagua River, but some which appeared on the market could have been looted from ancient graves. The great majority of goods traveled by sea, since roads were but poor trails and cargoes heavy. This kind of commerce was cornered by the Chontal Maya or Putun, such good seafarers that Thompson called them the Phoenicians of Middle America. Their route skirted the coast from the Aztec port of trade in Campeche, Chicalanco, around the peninsula and down to Nido near Lake Izabal, where their great canoes put in to exchange goods with the inland Maya. However, a special group of traders traveled the perilous overland trails under the protection of their own deity, Exchua, the Black God. Markets, Kiwik, are rarely mentioned where the lowland Maya are concerned, in contrast with Mexico, where they are so large that the Spaniards were astonished, and it is probable that they were. Unimportant, since there was little cause for heavy subsistence goods to change hands in this very uniform land, but we are told by one source that high Guatemalan markets were great and celebrated and very rich, and these have persisted to this very day. It was this trade that linked Mexico and the Maya, for they had much to exchange, especially cacao and the feathers of tropical birds for copper tools and ornaments, and it was probably the smooth business operations conducted by the Chontal that spared the Maya from the Aztec onslaught that had overwhelmed less cooperative peoples in Mesoamerica. The life cycle. Immediately after birth, Yucatecan mothers washed their infants and then fastened them to a cradle, their little heads compressed between two boards in such a way that after 2 days a permanent fore and aft flattening had taken place, which the Maya considered a mark of beauty. As soon as possible, the anxious parents went to consult with the priest so as to learn the density of their offspring, and the name which he or she was to bear until baptism. The Spanish fathers were quite astounded that the Maya had a baptismal rite, which took place at an auspicious time when there were a number of boys and girls between the ages of 3 and 12 in the settlement. The ceremony took place in the house of a town elder in the presence of their parents, who had observed various abstinences in honor of the occasion. The children and their fathers remained inside a court held by 4 old and venerable men representing the Cha'aks or rain gods, while the priests performed various acts of purification and blessed the candidates with incense, tobacco, and holy water. From that time on, the elder girls, at least, were marriageable. In both highlands and lowlands, boys and young men stayed apart from their families in special communal houses where they presumably learned the arts of war, and other things as well, for Landa says that the prostitutes were frequent visitors. Other youthful diversions were gambling and the ball game. The double standard was present among the Maya, for girls were strictly brought up by their mothers and suffered grievous punishments for lapses of chastity. Marriage was arranged by go-betweens, and as among all peoples with exogamous clans or lineages, there were strict rules about those with whom alliances could or could not be made. Particularly taboo was marriage with those of the same paternal name. Monogamy was the general custom, but important men who could afford it took more wives. Adultery was punished by death, as among the Mexicans. Ideas of personal comeliness were quite different from ours, although the friars were much impressed with the beauty of the Maya women. Both sexes had their frontal teeth in filled in various patterns, and we have many ancient Maya skulls in which the incisors have been inlaid with small plaques of jade. Until marriage, young men painted themselves black, and so did warriors at all times. Tattooing and decorative scarification began after wedlock, both men and women being richly elaborated from the waist up by these means. Slightly crossed eyes were held in great esteem, and parents attempted to induce the condition by hanging small beads over the noses of their children. Death was greatly dreaded by all, the more so since the deceased did not automatically go to any paradise. Ordinary folk were buried beneath the floors of their houses, their mouths filled with food and a jade bead, accompanied by idols and the things that they had used while alive. Into the graves of priests they are said to have placed books. Great nobles, however, were cremated, a practice probably of Mexican origin, and funerary temples were placed above their urns. In the earlier days, of course, inhumation in sepulchres beneath such mausoleums was the rule. To the Copan dynasty of Mayapan was reserved the practice of mummifying the heads of their defunct lords, these being kept in the family oratories and fed at regular intervals, a practice which, if even more ancient, may explain why some early royal burials at Tikal are missing their heads. Society and politics. The ancient Maya realm was no theocracy or primitive democracy, but a class society with strong political power in the hands of an hereditary elite. To understand the basis of the state in 16th century Yucatan, we have to go right to the heart of the matter, to the peoples themselves. In Yucatan, every adult Maya had two names. The first came to him or her from the mother, but could only be transmitted from women to their offspring, that is, in the female line. The second derived from the father, and similarly was exclusively passed on in the male line. There is now abundant evidence that these two kinds of name represented two different kinds of cross-cutting and coexistent descent groups, the matrilineage and the petrilineage. There were approximately 250 patrilineages in Yucatan at the time of the conquest, and we know from Lena how important they were. For instance, they were strictly exogamous. One had to marry out of the lineage. All inheritance of property was patrilineal, and they were self-protection societies, all members of which had the obligation to help each other. Titles deriving from early colonial times show that they had their own lands as well, which is probably what Landa meant when he said that all fields were held in common. As for the matrilineage, it probably acted principally within the marriage regulation system, in which matrimony with the father's sister's or mother's brother's daughter was encouraged, but certain other kinds forbidden. Now, while among many more primitive peoples such kin groups are theoretically equal, among the Maya this was not so, and both kinds of lineage were strictly ranked. To be able to trace one's genealogy in both lines to an ancient ancestry was an important matter, for there were strongly marked classes. At the top were the nobles, Almehen, meaning he whose descent is known on both sides, who had private lands and held the more important political offices, as well as filling the roles of high-ranking warriors, wealthy farmers and merchants, and clergy. The commoners were the free workers of the population, probably like their Aztec cousins, holding in usufruct from the patrilineage a stretch of forage in which to make their milpas. But in all likelihood, even these persons were graded into rich and poor. There was some indication of serfs who worked the private lands of the nobles, and at the bottom were the slaves, who were mostly plebeians taken in war, prisoners of higher rank being subject to the knife. Slavery was hereditary, but those menials could be redeemed by payments made by fellow members of one's patrilineage. By the time the Spaniards arrived, political power over much of the inhabited Maya was in the hands of the ruling castes of Mexican or Mexican-influenced origin. Yucatecan politics was controlled by such a group, which of course claimed to have come from Tula and Zwiwa, a legendary home in the West. In fact, any candidate for high office had to pass an occult catechism known as the language of Zwiwa. At the head of each statelet in Yucatan was the Halachwinik, real man, the territorial ruler who had inherited his post in the male line, although in an earlier epoch and among the Highland Maya there were real kings Ajawab who held sway over wider areas. The Halachwinik resided in a capital town and was supported by the products of his own hands, such as cacao groves worked by slaves and by tribute. The minor provincial towns were headed by the Barabab, appointed by the Halachwinik from a noble patrilineage related to his own. These ruled through local town councils made up of rich old men led by an important commoner chosen anew each year among the poor quarters which made up the settlement. Besides his administrative and magisterial duties, the Patab was a war leader, but his command was shared by a Nakam, a highly tabooed individual who held office for 3 years. The Maya were obsessed with war. The annals of the Caciques and the Pobalvu speak of little but intertribal conflict among the highlanders, while the 16 states of Yucatan were constantly battling with each other over boundaries and lineage honor. To this sanguinary record, we must add the testimony of the classic monuments and their inscriptions. From these and from the eyewitness descriptions of the conquistadors, we can see how Maya warfare was waged. The Hokanabra braves were the foot soldiers. They were cuirasses of quilted cotton or of tapir hide and carried thrusting spears with flint points, darts with spear thrower, and in the late post-classic times, the bow and arrow. Hostilities typically began with an unannounced guerrilla raid into the enemy camp to take captives, but more formal battle opened with the dreadful din of drums, whistles, shell trumpets, and war cries. On either side of the war, leaders and the idols carried into the combat under the care of the priests were the 2 flanks of infantry, from which rained darts, arrows, and stones flung from slings. Once the enemy had penetrated into home territory, however, irregular warfare was substituted, with ambuscades and all kinds of traps. Lesser captives ended up as slaves, but the nobles and war leaders had their hearts torn out on the sacrificial stone or else were beheaded, a form of sacrifice favored by the classic Maya. This concludes Chapter 8.